Shabbat Shalom. Question. Is it legal to call somebody hideously ugly? In London in 1996, the Court of Appeal heard some rather interesting arguments pertaining to that point. 2 years previously, a journalist called Julie Burchill, who's a bit notorious, had reviewed the film Frankenstein, and she described the creature in the film. And this is what she wrote. She wrote, "The creature is made as a vessel for Waldman's brain and rejected in disgust when it comes out all scarred and primeval. It's a very new look for the creature. No bolts in the neck or flat-top hairdo, and I think it works. It's a lot like Steven Berkoff, only marginally better looking." You may or may not know the actor Steven Berkoff. You probably do. He has been in Beverly Hills Cop. He played the villain in Octopussy, the James Bond movie, and he was most recently seen as Hendrik Vanger's attorney in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And it's fair to say of Steven Berkoff, that he's not known for playing romantic leads. But he did object to being described as this hideous and this ugly, and he sued. And Burchill's attorneys responded by saying that to call somebody ugly is not defamatory, by definition. And they went to a first instance hearing to establish whether that was the case. Is it or is it not defamatory to say of somebody that they're ugly when they look like Steven Berkoff? And the court found for Berkoff at first instance, and so Burchill pushed it one step further. She took it to the Court of Appeal, and she lost. The judges rejected her appeal 2-1, and the reason for that largely was that they paid attention not only to the words themselves, but the tone in which they were written. Lord Phillips, who was one of the judges who rejected the appeal, said, "There are many ways of indicating that a person is hideously ugly, ranging from a simple statement of opinion to that effect, which I feel could never be defamatory, to words plainly intended to convey that message by way of ridicule." And despite the fact that one judge dissented from that opinion, and his opinion, by the way, is very well worth a read. His name is Lord Justice Millett. He writes beautifully, really he does. He writes wonderful judgments, and he observes rather acidly in his dissenting judgment that Boris Karloff wasn't short of girlfriends, although he puts it more elegantly than I do. But the court, by a majority, seemed to hold that it's not just appearances that can be ugly. Speech can be ugly too. And the reason that I'm talking about the Berkoff case this morning, though to me, having had a past life, as some of you know, as at least partly a libel attorney, Berkoff and Burchill, is always worth telling, just for the story. The rabbis of our tradition make a strong link between ugly speech, that's the term I'm going to use this morning, lashon hara, and sara'at, which is the disease that we read about earlier this morning in the early part of the Torah portion. In our Torah portion, sara'at was attacking a building. And they make this link very early on in our tradition. They observe later in the Torah that when Miriam speaks out against Moses, and she does, she's really quite mean, and she is punished by becoming a metzorat, a person afflicted with sara'at. Aha! Say the rabbis, this has to be cause and effect. You spoke out against your brother and you got sara'at, and therefore we can learn from this that dissing somebody means that you're going to get very, very sick. And Judaism, as it evolves, as it goes on, takes ugly speech, lashon hara, it literally means evil tongue. It takes ugly speech extremely seriously. The Torah itself cautions us against lying, against false swearing, against bearing false witness, and against gossip, tale-bearing. And the Mishnah and the Talmud both developed these categories considerably, so that by the time we reach Maimonides in the 12th century, we have multiple definitions for people who indulge in this kind of ugly speech. In order from the least to the most offensive, these are Maimonides' categories, you have a rachil, a talebearer, who loads themselves up with words and goes from one person to another saying, X said this, or I heard such and such about Y. They are indulging in ugly speech, even, by the way, even if it's true. Think back to Berkhoff and Burchill. Someone who tells an outright lie about another person is called a motzi shem ra, a person who puts out a bad name. And then you have the master level. You have the ba'al lashon hara, the master of the ugly tongue. And this person is marked by their insidiousness, with which they make references to people and their ancestry and things that they have said about them. They would fall under English law into this marvelous category of libel by innuendo. Isn't it a great word? As well as direct libel and direct slander. And the later tradition continues. We, as the Jewish tradition, continue to be preoccupied by this question of ugly speech. For Rabbi Israel Meir Kagan, who was called the Chafetz Chaim, Lithuania, 19th century, it was a lifetime fascination. And when he wasn't writing a rather useful commentary called the Mishnah Berurah, he created 2 whole books on the subject of Lashon Hara. And if you're not familiar with the Hasidic story about the pillow and the feathers, ask your children. It's one of Rabbi Bernhardt's favorite stories. He's been telling it for quite a few generations now. Or you may know it yourself. It's true, right? It's a classic story about the pillow and the feathers, and clearly you know it from your reaction, and therefore I am not going to tell it here, but I will observe that the categories for ugly speech continue to expand and expand. So, it's ugly speech even if it's true. It's ugly speech even if you include yourself in the category of people you are dissing. It's ugly speech if you cause another person to labor under a misapprehension. It's ugly speech to ask somebody to do something when you know that they are not capable of doing it, and so on and so on. So we should ask, what makes ugly speech quite so bad? Why is it regarded as so reprehensible in the Jewish tradition, and why are the categories so wide? Well, language and the ability to communicate are things that we share with other creatures with which we inhabit this planet. That has to be said. But the human species' relationship with the power of speech really is something that no other species shares. The earliest Aramaic translation of the Torah, it's called the Targum Onkelos, pinpoints the moment when the human's capacity to speak begins. It says that moment happened when God breathed life into the clay figure that God had made. And that ruach, that spirit of God, went into the human being and turned into the power to speak. And so we might understand this as saying that speech, like our souls, when we speak, God, a little piece of God, is manifesting in the world. And perhaps that's why we need to guard ourselves so closely when we speak. But it's difficult. It's really hard to remember that we need to do that. Why? Why is it so difficult not to misuse that little piece of God that lives inside us? There's a few answers. One answer, of course, is that the dark side wins, pure and simple. There is something really delicious about conveying clandestine information. Bad speech makes us powerful. We hold the keys to someone's joy or their pain, and we might have better command of language than they do, perhaps. And so it is just irresistible to turn ugly. And perhaps, again, this is what I think Birchall was feeling when she wrote about Berkhoff. I dare say she didn't bargain for his rather robust response, but then she doesn't know Stephen Berkhoff. Guess she does now. And I wonder if there is an echo of her when we also indulge in ugly speech. We're abusing our power. And if we're honest, if we're really honest with ourselves, then I think perhaps there is. Or possibly, we indulge in bad speech because we've fallen into the trap of thinking that there are absolutely watertight categories of right and wrong in the world. So if somebody is 100% wrong, and in this mindset, it is absolutely possible to be 100% wrong. If somebody is 100% wrong, well, all we're doing is telling it like it is, right? We're entitled to do that. We are entitled to have an opinion if somebody is in the wrong. But again, we need to be careful, because ugly speech of that kind creates these ripples of negativity. The Midrash Tanchuma, it's a late Midrash, maybe 12th century, and it teaches that bad speech, ugly speech, kills three people: the person who speaks it, the person who hears it, and the person who repeats it. It's as if the stuff is like gelignite on a bumpy cart. We have to avoid any conceivable bump, because as soon as there's a bump, boom, and the whole lot is going to explode. And yet we still do it. We stir up these little eddies of destructiveness, and then we walk away feeling all smug and self-righteous because we were right, weren't we? We were right, that person was in the wrong. And both of those are good explanations about what drives us to abuse this gift. But I think we can go one better this morning, because I think we need to consider more closely why it is that our tradition from so early on has analogized ugly speech with this disease, with tzarat. Now, tzarat gets very badly mistranslated. What is the normal mistranslation for this disease? Leprosy, absolutely. Clearly, tzarat is absolutely nothing of the kind. It's nothing like it at all. Tzarat, I'm not going to translate it, tzarat can infect human skin in all sorts of different ways. It can infect fabric. It can infect buildings. It is probably more like some kind of fungal infection. Not even a virus, it's some kind of fungus. And we know a few things about fungal infections. We know that they spread very quickly. We know that once they've established themselves, they are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to eradicate. And we know that if we don't treat them, at least to keep them under control, then eventually they are going to demolish whatever structure in which they have set up home. And they uglify. They attack the inherent beauty of whatever it is that they infect. You only have to look at a fungus infection on a fingernail to see what a fungus is capable of doing. They take what is beautiful and well made and they turn it ugly. There's a chap called Dr. Richard Michael. He writes on the Inner Self website, and there are a few good articles out there exploring the inner psychology of ugly speech, gossip. And Michael writes that gossip begins with someone building somebody else up and making them more important than themselves. The heart becomes wounded, he writes, because you have temporarily filled an empty space within it with someone other than yourself and your own individual importance. And Dr. Margaret Paul, on a similar kind of website, says something similar. She says, gossip is a way of avoiding responsibility for your feelings. It's used by the wounded self as a way to connect with others, because that wounded self has numerous ways to connect with others other than being authentic, such as drinking or smoking pot or ridiculing others, or even using things like food, all of which are intended to get a sense of closeness that spares you the obligation to be authentic. And if we think about Lashon Hara, if we think about ugly speech that way, then the analogy with Tzarat becomes clear. We misuse our God-given speech not out of hunger for power or maliciousness alone, although both of those are motivations, but we misuse that power because we are trying to fill our emptiness with another person's self. Our boundaries are broken. We don't distinguish anymore the difference between the self and the other. We don't know where we end and the other person begins. And that is precisely what Tzarat does. It attacks the layers in which we cover ourselves. It attacks our homes. Within our homes, it attacks the fabric that we dress ourselves in. Underneath the fabric, Tzarat is attacking our own skin. It translates our inside brokenness into an external sign that other people can see. The ugliness of our fragility becomes manifest on the outside. Our battle against ugly speech, and this is why it's so hard to win, our battle against ugly speech is a battle against our own inside weakness. Now, there's a whole other sermon that now opens itself up as a possibility, but which I'm not going to treat you to this morning because I've already spoken long. But consider the way that the Torah suggests that we treat Tzarat. What do? First of all, we diagnose. We send somebody who is not afflicted with the disease to diagnose it. We send another person in. Then we isolate, so as to build those boundaries back up again, maybe, so as to heal the breaches in ourselves, inside and outside. And then we ritualize the moment when, whole once more, we re-enter the community and we cleanse ourselves to celebrate the fact that once again our boundaries are intact. Now, of course, in our lives, in the ugly speech in which we indulge, all of us, day after day, this is an ongoing process. And each of us is liable in any given day to be at various stages of that work, depending on which situations have prompted us to protect our vulnerability by becoming ugly. The Torah is teaching us this week that we cannot walk away from that work. It is vital work, and we need to commit to doing it. And if we can, or at least if we try, we can avoid the true hideousness of the Burchell and Berkoff case. The ugliness that was not in the description per se, but in the words, which is why I personally believe that that case was rightly decided. And perhaps if we commit ourselves to living that way, we can bring about a little bit more healing in this broken world of ours that is filled with broken people. And perhaps we can feel a little bit better about ourselves as a result. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.